March 10, 241 BC. The Mediterranean Sea, usually a jewel of deep azure, had turned a churning, frothing mixture of oil, wood, and blood. If you were silent, if you listened past the crashing waves, you wouldn't hear the wind. You would hear the screams of 10,000 drowning men. This was not just a battle. This was an execution. History remembers Rome as the inevitable master of the world. An unstoppable machine of conquest. But we often forget that empires are not born, they are forged in the fires of near extinction. And on this day, among the jagged rocks of the Aegates Islands, the Roman Republic was mere inches away from total collapse. They were bankrupt. They were exhausted. They were fighting a war that had dragged on for 23 agonizing years. A generation of young men had been fed to the meat grinder of Sicily. But on this morning, against all logic, against the wind itself, Rome decided to roll the dice one last time. Welcome to the Battle of the Aegates Islands. The day the sea turned red, and the day the fate of the Western world was sealed forever. To understand the sheer desperation of this moment, we have to look back. For over 2 decades, Rome and Carthage, the two heavyweights of the ancient world, had been locked in a death grip. This was the First Punic War. It was a slugfest that had drained both nations dry. Carthage, the wealthy merchant empire of North Africa, ruled the waves. Their ships were legendary, their sailors were the best in the world. Rome, on the other hand, was a land power. Before this war, Romans barely knew how to swim, let alone fight on water. Yet, for 20 years, they had tried, and failed, and tried again. By 242 BC, both sides were like two boxers in the final round, battered, bloody, and barely standing. But here lies the difference that changed history. Carthage looked at its empty treasury and said, "Enough." They grew complacent. They believed Rome was broke. They believed Rome could not possibly build another fleet. So Carthage, in a fatal error of judgment, deactivated their navy. They left their ships to rot in the harbor. They sent their sailors home. They thought the war was effectively over. They were wrong. Rome was indeed broke. The government treasury was empty. There was no gold left to pay shipwrights. No silver to hire rowers. But the spirit of Rome was not broken. In an unprecedented act of patriotism, the wealthy citizens of Rome, the private individuals, stepped forward. They pooled their fortunes. They sold their jewelry, their land, their slaves. They didn't wait for taxes. They crowdfunded a fleet. 200 quinqueremes. Built in secret. Built with a hunger for vengeance. But these were not the clumsy Roman ships of the past. The Romans had learned a hard lesson. In the early years, they relied on the corvus, a massive boarding bridge that allowed them to turn sea battles into land battles. It was effective, but it was heavy. It made the ships unstable. Thousands of Romans had drowned not because of enemy fire, but because their top-heavy ships capsized in storms. So, for this final gamble, the corvus was gone. The new Roman ships were a marvel of reverse engineering. They were not built from scratch, they were modeled after the ultimate prize, the captured blockade runner of Hannibal the Rhodian. A Carthaginian masterpiece of speed and agility that the Romans had hunted down, captured, and dissected plank by plank. These new vessels were stripped down. Lean. Predators of the deep. They were no longer floating platforms for infantry. They were missiles. The weapon was no longer the soldier on the deck, it was the ship itself. The bronze ram at the bow, sharpened to a razor's edge, was the only thing that mattered. Commanding this last-ditch armada was Gaius Lutatius Catullus. A man who knew the stakes. He drilled his crews relentlessly. Day after day, they practiced maneuvering, synchronized rowing, turning on a dime. They transformed from a mob of landlubbers into a precision instrument of death. And then, they waited. They hid their ships behind the Aegates Islands, a cluster of rocks off the western tip of Sicily. They lay in ambush, waiting for the lifeline of Carthage. Carthage had to resupply their army in Sicily, led by the brilliant and undefeated Hamilcar Barca. Without food, Hamilcar would starve. So Carthage scraped together a relief fleet. Hundreds of transport ships, heavy, loaded with grain, carrying supplies for the army. They were escorted by warships, but these ships were undermanned. Their crews were raw recruits. They were not ready for a fight. They were just trying to make a delivery. The Carthaginian commander, Hanno, pushed his fleet hard. He had a strong wind at his back. A westerly gale blowing straight towards Sicily. He thought the speed and the rough seas would protect him. He thought no sane commander would sail out into the teeth of a storm to intercept him. He underestimated Catullus. On the morning of March 10th, the Roman lookouts saw the white sails of Carthage on the horizon. The wind was howling. The waves were smashing against the Roman hulls. Catullus faced a nightmare decision. If he attacked, he would be rowing directly into the wind. His ships would be fighting the current, fighting the gale, slowing them down, making them vulnerable. But if he waited, if he let Hanno pass, Hamilcar would be resupplied. The war would go on. Rome would fall. He looked at the storm. He looked at his men. And he gave the order that would separate victory from defeat. Cut the anchors. Lower the masts. Leave the sails on the shore. This was the masterstroke. While the Carthaginian ships were rigged for sailing, keeping their heavy masts and canvas to catch the wind, the Romans stripped themselves of every ounce of unnecessary weight. They left their means of escape back on the beach. There was no going back. They would win by the oar, or they would die by the oar. Catullus raised the battle standards. Attack. The Roman rowers, muscles screaming, veins popping, drove their oars into the chaotic sea. They powered forward, smashing through the whitecaps, driving straight into the oncoming wind. It was a feat of impossible physical endurance. Hanno, seeing the Roman line emerging from the mist, must have felt his heart stop. He scrambled to prepare for battle. But his ships were heavy. They were loaded with thousands of tons of grain. They still had their masts up, making them top-heavy in the rough swells. They were sluggish pigs in the water. They couldn't turn. They couldn't accelerate. And the Romans, they were light. They were fast. They were sharks circling a pod of whales. The fleets collided with the sound of a thunder crack. The sound of a naval ram hitting a wooden hull is a terrifying thing. It is the sound of a forest snapping in half. The Roman ships, using their superior speed, drove their bronze rams deep into the ribs of the Carthaginian vessels. Wood shattered. Seawater rushed into the breaches. Because the Carthaginian ships were so heavy with cargo, they didn't just sink, they plummeted down into the abyss, dragging their crews with them. But the Romans didn't just ram. They executed the ruthless Diekplus maneuver. They surged through the gaps in the enemy line at full speed. As they passed close by, they retracted their own oars, and let their hulls shear through the enemy's extended oars. Snap. 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 In seconds, the Carthaginian ships were stripped of their propulsion. Their rowers were maimed, their oars were splintered. They were left dead in the water, helpless spinning targets for the final killing blow. On the decks, it was chaos. The Carthaginian marines, outnumbered and unbalanced on their rocking ships, couldn't stand against the disciplined Roman infantry. But mostly, this was a battle of the rams. Ship after ship, the pride of Carthage, was turned into driftwood. 50 Carthaginian ships were sent to the bottom in the first hour. 70 more were captured, their crews dragged away in chains. The rest, seeing the slaughter, turned and fled as the wind shifted. The sea was littered with the wreckage of an empire. The grain that was meant to save the Carthaginian army now floated uselessly on the waves, mixed with the bodies of the sailors who had transported it. In one single morning, Rome had obliterated the naval power of Carthage. The consequences were immediate, and they were catastrophic for Carthage. Without a navy, Carthage could not supply Hamilcar Barca in Sicily. The undefeated general, the men who had held the Romans at bay for years, was forced to surrender. Not because he was beaten on the battlefield, but because he was strangled by the sea. The Treaty of Lutatius was signed. It was a humiliation. Carthage had to leave Sicily. They had to pay a massive war indemnity. 3,200 talents of silver, a sum so large it crippled their economy for decades. Rome took control of the Mediterranean. The First Punic War was over. Rome had won. But stories like this, they rarely end with a neat bow. In the aftermath of the surrender, Hamilcar Barca returned to Carthage. He was angry. He was bitter. He felt betrayed by his own government, by the corrupt politicians who had let the navy rot. He looked at the wreckage of his nation, and he made a promise. He took his young son, a boy of only 9 years old, into the temple of Baal. He made the boy place his hand on the sacrificial fire. And he made him swear an oath. An oath that would echo through history. I swear that so long as age permits, I will use fire and steel to arrest the destiny of Rome. I will never be a friend to the Roman people. That boy's name was Hannibal. And so, while the Romans celebrated their victory at the Aegates Islands, while they paraded their spoils through the streets of Rome, they did not know that they had just sown the seeds of their own near destruction. They had won the war, but they had created a monster. The Battle of the Aegates Islands was the end of the beginning. But the true storm, the storm named Hannibal, was just gathering on the horizon. So, I ask you, was Catullus a military genius for attacking into the storm, or was he simply a desperate gambler who got lucky? And if Carthage had simply thrown their cargo overboard before the battle, could they have turned the tide? History is written by the victors, but the lessons are there for us all. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most pivotal naval battles, make sure to subscribe and hit that bell. You do not want to miss our next episode, where we follow the boy who swore that oath, into the nightmare of the Second Punic War. Until then, keep looking to the past.